5,000 years ago, before Greece, before Rome, before the pyramids of Giza pierced the Egyptian sky, scribes in southern Mesopotamia were already mapping the stars. They were calculating lunar eclipses. They were predicting planetary movements. They were recording complex mathematical equations onto clay. They were building monumental temple platforms aligned with cosmic order. And they were doing all of this at the dawn of recorded history. No telescopes. No inherited scientific tradition that we can clearly trace. No earlier documented civilization teaching them how. So the question that continues to disturb historians, archaeologists, and scholars alike is this. How did the first civilization know so much? This is not a story of aliens. It is not a story of fantasy. It is not mythology presented as fact. It is a story grounded in archaeology, texts, and material evidence. But it is also a story that forces us to confront something unsettling. Because when we examine the intellectual world of the Sumerian civilization, we are not looking at primitive beginnings. We're looking at sophistication. And sophistication does not emerge from nothing. To understand the depth of their knowledge, we begin where they began, with the sky. Long before later Babylonian astronomy formalized planetary prediction models, the Sumerians were observing the heavens with disciplined consistency. Clay tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites reveal structured star lists and celestial observations that date back to the late 3rd millennium BCE. These were not random notes. They cataloged constellations. They tracked lunar phases. They associated celestial cycles with agricultural timing. The sky was not decoration. It was a clock, a calendar, and a divine manuscript. Later Mesopotamian texts, such as the Muel.Appen series, would systematize star catalogs, but their roots reach back into early Sumerian observational tradition. Even at this early stage, we see method, repeated observation, recorded results, pattern recognition. This is proto-science. And here lies the crucial point. Systematic astronomy requires time. It requires generational continuity. It requires institutions capable of preserving and transmitting data. The Sumerians had already built those institutions. Temples and cities such as Uruk and Uar were not merely religious centers. They were administrative hubs. They housed scribal schools. They archived tablets. They preserved economic records, ritual texts, and celestial observations. Knowledge was not accidental in Sumer. It was institutionalized. The question becomes deeper. How did such institutions arise so early? One explanation is environmental necessity. Living between the Tigris and Euphrates required coordination. Irrigation systems demanded measurement. Measurement required mathematics. Mathematics encouraged abstraction. Abstraction opened the door to symbolic thought. And yet, even accepting this gradual development, what we encounter in the archaeological record appears astonishingly mature. Their number system was sexagesimal, base 60. This system was flexible and mathematically efficient. It allowed complex fraction manipulation and remains embedded in our measurement of time and angles today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not trivial inheritances. They are intellectual frameworks, and they originated in Sumer. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, building upon Sumerian foundations, even demonstrate solutions to quadratic equations and geometric problems. While these later developments evolved, they rest upon groundwork laid by early Mesopotamian scholars. Again, we ask, how does such abstraction arise so early? The Sumerians themselves offered an answer. They attributed foundational knowledge to divine beings known as the Anunnaki. In Sumerian cosmology, these were high-ranking deities associated with creation, kingship, and the structuring of the world. Texts describe civilization itself, writing, law, crafts, agriculture, as divine decrees or powers granted to humanity. The were not random gifts. They were ordered principles. In mythological narratives, these principles were transferred from divine realm to human society, legitimizing kingship and cultural structure. Now, Academically speaking, historians interpret these myths symbolically. They reflect how early societies understood the origin of culture. When knowledge seems too profound to explain, it is framed as divine. But what is fascinating is not the supernatural claim. It is the recognition that knowledge was perceived as something structured, powerful, and transferable. The Sumerians understood that civilization required encoded systems, and they encoded them everywhere. Consider the architecture. The ziggurat of Ur was not randomly constructed. Its orientation aligns closely with cardinal directions. Its tiered structure symbolized cosmic order, a stairway between heaven and earth. But beyond symbolism, alignment required observation. Determining cardinal directions with precision requires consistent tracking of sunrise and sunset points. It requires awareness of seasonal variation. It requires astronomical attention. Architecture in Sumer was not merely religious, it was cosmological. Cities themselves were organized spaces reflecting divine hierarchy. The temple complex dominated the urban layout. Economic activity radiated from it. Residential districts formed around administrative centers. This is spatial intelligence, urban planning at scale, and it predates Egyptian monumental architecture. Trade further accelerated intellectual growth. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive trade networks linking southern Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Levant, the Persian Gulf, and the Indus Valley civilization. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, metals from distant regions. These materials circulated through Sumerian markets. Trade requires measurement. Measurement requires standardization. Standardization requires mathematical consistency. Cuneiform tablets document contracts, debts, inventories, and wage calculations. This is economic sophistication. And economic sophistication strengthens intellectual institutions. Scribes were trained in formal schools known as Idaba, tablet houses. Students copied lexical lists, mathematical exercises, and literary texts. Education was structured. Knowledge was cumulative. Here we encounter something vital. Civilization is not merely innovation. It is preservation. Without archives, observation dies. Without scribes, mathematics dissolves. Without institutions, genius cannot scale. The Sumerians built the earliest known knowledge infrastructure. Yet another dimension deepens the mystery. Their flood narratives. Texts such as the Sumerian flood story, later echoed in the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, describe a catastrophic deluge sent by the gods. Archaeological layers in Mesopotamia reveal evidence of localized flooding events. Were these myths memories of environmental trauma? Possibly. But they also reveal something else, historical consciousness. The Sumerians were not only observing the present, they were attempting to record the past. They constructed king lists stretching back before recorded history, blending myth and memory. The Sumerian king list describes rulers reigning for impossibly long durations before a great flood. Historians interpret this as symbolic chronology, but it reflects something profound, a desire to organize time, to map continuity, to define beginnings. Civilization had become self-aware. Then came political consolidation. Around 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad rose to power and established what historians recognize as the Akkadian Empire, one of the first multi-ethnic empires in history. Sumerian culture did not vanish. It was absorbed. The Akkadians adopted cuneiform writing. They inherited religious structures. They preserved Sumerian literature. Even as political dominance shifted, intellectual legacy endured. This is critical. When knowledge survives conquest, it means it was deeply embedded. But why did it begin so powerfully in the first place? Modern scholarship emphasizes gradual development. Excavations at earlier sites, such as Eridu, reveal long, occupational sequences stretching back to the Ubaid period. Cultural continuity did exist, and yet the acceleration remains remarkable. By 300 BCE, nearly every structural component of civilization was in place. Writing, urban centers, formal religion, mathematics, law codes, monumental construction, long-distance trade, astronomical observation. It is not that Sumer appeared from nowhere. It is that it consolidated everything. It integrated disparate human capacities into a coherent system. Perhaps that is the true breakthrough. Not invention in isolation, but integration at scale. When we ask, who gave the Sumerians their knowledge, the most historically responsible answer is layered. Environmental pressure demanded cooperation. Cooperation required administration. Administration required writing. Writing enabled accumulation. Accumulation accelerated innovation. But within that framework, something else remains undeniable. They thought symbolically at extraordinary depth. They perceived cosmic order and mirrored it in urban order. They linked law with astronomy. They connected mathematics with ritual. They unified knowledge domains that modern society often separates. And they did so at the dawn of recorded history. The mystery, then, is not supernatural. It is human. It is the mystery of how intelligence scales, how small communities become systems, how observation becomes science, how memory becomes archive, and how archive becomes civilization. The Sumerians did not leave behind pyramids of limestone that dominate tourism brochures. Their mud brick cities eroded. Their language ceased to be spoken conversationally, but their intellectual DNA persists. When you read a contract, when you check the time, when you measure a circle, when governments codify law, you're operating within frameworks first stabilized in Sumer. They did not invent everything, but they stabilized everything. They were the first to assemble civilization's components into durable form. And in doing so, they changed the trajectory of humanity permanently. So who gave them their knowledge? Not gods descending from the sky, not mythical beings handing them secrets, but generations of observation, environmental struggle, institutional memory, and a revolutionary idea that knowledge can be written, preserved, systematized, expanded. The real miracle of Sumer is not mystery. It is continuity. They transformed fragile human memory into durable record. They transformed scattered villages into organized cities. They transformed survival into structure. And once structure exists, progress compounds. The Sumerians stand at the threshold of history, not because they were superhuman, but because they were the first to build a system that allowed human intelligence to accumulate. And that accumulation, that compounding of knowledge, is what gave birth to the world we now inhabit. 5,000 years later, their clay tablets still speak, and in their quiet, wedge-shaped marks, they remind us of something powerful. Civilization begins the moment knowledge refuses to die. And in Sumer, knowledge became immortal. And so, when we ask who gave the Sumerians their knowledge, perhaps the deeper question is this: what happens when human curiosity refuses to disappear? 5,000 years ago, on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity crossed a threshold. Not into myth, not into legend, but into memory. The Sumerians did something irreversible. They wrote, they calculated, they mapped the heavens, they organized cities, they preserved law, they built systems that outlived their language, their rulers, even their gods. And in doing so, they proved something that still echoes today. Civilization is not born from mystery alone. It is born from the courage to record, to observe, to question, and to build structures that outlast the fragile human lifespan. Their temples have fallen. Their mud brick cities have turned to dust. But their ideas remain. Every time you look at a clock, every time you sign a contract, every time humanity reaches for the stars, you are standing on foundations laid in Sumer. That is the real law. That is the real dread. Because if this was the beginning, how much of what we call modern is simply inherited memory? And what truths still lie buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, waiting to rewrite what we think we know? If you felt the weight of that question, if you felt the ancient pulse beneath history itself, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. This is Dew of Dread, where history is not just told, it is uncovered. If you're drawn to the mysteries before the pyramids, the civilizations before recorded memory, the knowledge that shaped our world long before we understood it. Then subscribe to Dew of Dread. Turn on notifications, because this is only the beginning. The deeper we go into the past, the clearer the present becomes. And trust me, we're just getting started.